Welcome to your deep dive. We're going on a journey through history today, exploring how different cultures have viewed and treated homosexuality. You've given me some excerpts from The Construction of Homosexuality by David Greenberg.
Yeah, it's a fascinating book.
And we're excited to uncover some fascinating insights that are buried within its pages.
Absolutely. And I think you'll find this deep dive especially interesting. It really challenges us to think about how something as personal as sexuality has been shaped by societal forces across history.
Well, I have to admit, I kind of went into this thinking it was a pretty straightforward story of repression and then eventual liberation,
Yeah,
But Greenberg paints a much more nuanced picture, doesn't he?
he does. One of the first myths that Greenberg dismantles is this idea that homosexuality has always and everywhere been condemned. He shows us that societies have responded in remarkably diverse ways, sometimes even integrating same-sex relationships into their social structures.
Give me an example. Like, what's one way a culture might have viewed homosexuality that might surprise our listeners?
Take ancient Greece, for example. Many people know about the concept of pederasty,
Right.
but it's often misunderstood. For the ancient Greeks, the relationship between an older man and an adolescent boy wasn't just about sex. It was about mentorship, education, and shaping young men into ideal citizens.
Okay, so it was a societal institution with its own set of rules and expectations. But through a modern lens, it's hard not to see the inherent power imbalance in those relationships.
Absolutely, we have to acknowledge that. But the point is that for the ancient Greeks, this was considered an acceptable, even celebrated part of their culture. And it highlights how our understanding of what's considered normal or deviant is very much a product of our own time and place.
That's such a crucial point. And Greenberg lays out a framework for understanding these different cultural responses, right? He talks about four main types of societies.
He does. You have age-structured societies where same-sex relations might be common among young men as a part of initiation rites or warrior bonding, but they're expected to transition to heterosexual roles later in life.
So like a phase of life rather than a fixed identity.
Exactly. And then you have gender-transformed societies, which recognize a third gender category that often embodies both masculine and feminine traits.
Right.
These individuals might engage in same-sex relations and often hold important social and spiritual roles within their communities.
We see this in cultures like the Native American tribes with the bird ache tradition, right?
Right.
Where individuals who didn't conform to strict gender roles were actually revered in some cases.
Right. And Greenberg points out a fascinating correlation. The acceptance of this third gender often corresponds with the overall status of women in that society. Societies that grant women more autonomy and respect tend to be more accepting of gender variance in general.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it that way, but it makes sense. The way a culture treats one form of difference can be a reflection of its attitude towards difference as a whole.
Precisely. Now, the third type is what Greenberg calls role-differentiated societies. Here, there's a distinct social role or identity associated with homosexuality, but without a third gender category.
So it's acknowledged and integrated into the social fabric in a particular way.
Exactly. Think of the Mollies in 18th century England. They were often associated with specific occupations and social functions. And while they might have faced discrimination, their presence was nonetheless recognized within society.
Interesting. So we've got these three very different ways of approaching homosexuality, all integrated into the very fabric of those societies. What's the fourth type?
The fourth category is where homosexuality is reported to be absent or extremely rare. However, Greenberg cautions us to be skeptical of these reports, especially those coming from cultures heavily influenced by Western colonialism and its rigid views on sexuality.
Because people might be afraid to speak openly about it, or because their own cultural understandings have been suppressed?
Exactly. It highlights how important it is to consider the biases and power dynamics that shape how we study and understand these topics.
Well, we've already covered so much ground. But I want to go back to this idea that perceptions of homosexuality haven't always been negative. We talked about ancient Greece, but what about other ancient civilizations?
Well, ancient Egypt is particularly intriguing. While homosexuality wasn't as openly embraced as in Greece, the evidence suggests that it wasn't heavily stigmatized either, at least during certain periods.
Are there any examples that really illustrate that point?
There's the tomb of Neankhnum and Kumhotep. These two men, both royal manicurists,
Okay.
and hairdressers were buried together, and the artwork in the tomb depicts them in incredibly intimate poses. The tomb itself was a gift from the king, which suggests a certain level of acceptance at the highest levels of society.
It's amazing how these little glimpses into the past can really challenge our assumptions.
Absolutely. And Mesopotamia offers another interesting perspective. While the sources don't explicitly mention homosexual acts, there were transgender temple priests associated with the goddess Ishtar who played important roles in religious ceremonies.
So, a recognition of gender fluidity within a religious context.
Precisely. And then, of course, we have ancient Rome. Roman law technically prohibited some forms of homosexual behavior, but the enforcement was inconsistent, and it seems to have been relatively common even among the elite.
So, perhaps a don't ask, don't tell situation.
Perhaps. And this brings us to a turning point in our story, the rise of Christianity and the shift in attitudes towards sexuality that are brought about.
Right, because with Christianity, we see the emergence of a very different worldview. Tell me more about that.
Well, one of the key concepts that took hold during this time was dualism, this idea of a separation between spirit and flesh, good and evil.
Okay.
And this had a profound impact on how people viewed sexuality.
Because suddenly pleasure and the body become associated with sin, while purity and the spirit are elevated.
Exactly. And within this framework, any sex that wasn't for the purpose of procreation was seen as inherently sinful, and homosexuality was particularly condemned, often using the biblical story of Sodom and Gomorrah as justification.
That's a powerful image to draw on. A city destroyed by God's wrath because of its sinfulness. It's not hard to see how that would shape people's views.
And this condemnation of homosexuality was part of a broader rejection of pleasure and sensuality that really shaped Western thought for centuries. It wasn't just about sex. It was about a whole way of viewing the world and the human experience.
Okay, so we see this shift happening in the late Roman period. What happens as we move into the Middle Ages? It's often stereotyped as a time of intense repression, isn't it?
It is. But Greenberg actually reveals a more complex picture. Early medieval society was more tolerant than you might think. Legal punishments for sodomy were relatively rare, at least initially.
Really? That's surprising.
Yes. But things began to change in the 12th and 13th centuries. We see stricter laws being put in place and persecution increases. This is also a time of significant social and political upheaval, with the church consolidating its power and growing anxieties about heresy and social control.
So cracking down on what was perceived as deviant behavior became part of a larger effort to maintain order and control.
Exactly. And the rise of urban centers, with their anonymity and greater visibility of diverse behaviors, likely contributed to this anxiety.
But even with these stricter laws, did people still find ways to express themselves?
Absolutely. Homosexual activity continued, often within underground subcultures that were able to operate beneath the radar of official scrutiny. It's a classic case of you can't legislate away human nature.
It sounds like we're about to enter a period of even greater change as we move into the early modern period and the Enlightenment.
Yes.
What can our listeners expect in part 2?
We'll get ready for some paradigm shifts. The Enlightenment brought about a wave of new ideas about reason, individual liberty, and the questioning of traditional authority, which had a profound impact on how people viewed sexuality.
So the seeds of change are being planted. I can't wait to see how it all unfolds. Join us next time as we continue our deep dive into the fascinating history of how societies have viewed and treated homosexuality.
It'll be great.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the history of homosexuality.
Yeah.
When we left off, we were talking about the stricter laws and increased persecution that began in like the 12th and 13th centuries.
Yeah.
It seems like a real turning point, a shift towards greater control over what was considered acceptable behavior.
It was a time of significant change, and those anxieties about social order continued into the early modern period.
Mhm.
But as we move into the Enlightenment, we start to see those rigid ideas challenged in fascinating ways.
I'm really curious to dig into that because the Enlightenment is often seen as this like era of reason and individual liberty. Did that extend to how people thought about sexuality?
It's complex, but definitely. While outright acceptance of homosexuality was still rare, some Enlightenment thinkers began to question traditional morality and religious dogma, planting the seeds for later shifts in attitudes. Remember, this was a time when people were challenging the authority of the church and the monarchy, so it makes sense that those challenges would extend to social norms as well.
It's like a crack in the foundation of those traditional power structures, and new ideas are starting to seep through.
Exactly. And Greenberg highlights a key shift in thinking during this time, a growing belief that individuals should have greater autonomy over their bodies and personal lives. This was a radical idea at the time, directly challenging centuries of religious and societal control.
So instead of seeing sexuality as something dictated by religious doctrine, it's starting to be viewed as a matter of personal choice.
That's the key shift. Of course, it didn't happen overnight, and there was still significant resistance to these new ideas. But it's crucial to see these intellectual currents as laying the groundwork for the changes that would come later.
Okay, so we have the Enlightenment chipping away at those traditional views. What happens next in this evolution? Does the momentum for change continue to build?
Well, the 19th century brings about a truly pivotal shift that fundamentally altered how we understand homosexuality, the rise of science and the medicalization of homosexuality.
So instead of being seen as a sin against God, same-sex attraction starts to be viewed as a medical or psychological condition.
Precisely. Physicians began to categorize and pathologize same-sex attraction, viewing it as a mental illness, a sign of degeneration, even a form of insanity.
That's a pretty dramatic change. What led to this shift? Why did doctors suddenly become so interested in categorizing sexuality in this way?
There are a few factors at play here. First, this was a time of incredible growth in the field of medicine.
Yeah.
Doctors were trying to understand and classify all sorts of human behaviors and conditions, and sexuality became a key area of interest.
It's like the scientific lens was being turned onto every aspect of human experience, and sexuality was no exception.
Right. And this is where degeneracy theory comes in. It was this incredibly harmful idea that certain behaviors, including homosexuality, were signs of biological and moral decay, threatening the very fabric of society.
I've heard of that term, but could you explain it a bit more? Like, what were the core tenets of degeneracy theory, and how did it impact views on homosexuality?
Essentially, degeneracy theory argued that these deviant traits, including homosexuality, were hereditary and could be passed down through generations, weakening society as a whole. It fed into anxieties about social purity and the idea that certain groups were inherently inferior or dangerous.
It sounds like a precursor to eugenics, with its focus on improving the human race through selective breeding and the elimination of undesirable traits.
You're exactly right. And the impact on the perception of homosexuality was devastating. It went from being seen as a sin to a medical problem, something to be cured, controlled, or even eradicated.
So instead of religious persecution, we now have medical intervention as a form of control.
Exactly. It led to all sorts of attempts to treat homosexuality through therapy, medication, even institutionalization in mental asylums. And this medical model was used to justify discrimination and marginalization, painting homosexuality as a threat to public health, morality, and even national security.
It's a chilling reminder of how so-called scientific theories can be twisted to serve prejudice and control. And it seems like another example of how those in power, whether it's the church or the medical establishment, seek to enforce their own views on what is considered normal.
Absolutely. And it highlights the fact that science is never neutral. It's always shaped by the social and cultural context in which it operates.
So we've gone from sin to sickness as the dominant way of understanding homosexuality. What happens as we move into the 20th century? Does this medical model continue to hold sway?
Well, the 20th century is a time of intense conflict and change. On the one hand, we see continued repression, particularly in the aftermath of the World Wars, which reinforced traditional gender roles and anxieties about masculinity.
Because any deviation from those strict gender norms was seen as a weakness or a threat to national unity, especially during times of war.
Exactly. But at the same time, we see the emergence of something new and powerful, gay subcultures, especially in urban centers. These subcultures provided spaces for people to connect, build community, and begin to challenge the dominant narrative about homosexuality.
It's like these pockets of resistance are forming, creating a space for new ideas and identities to flourish, even in the face of widespread hostility.
Exactly. And it's out of these subcultures that the modern gay liberation movement will emerge.
And I'm guessing the Stonewall riots in 1969 mark a major turning point in that movement.
Absolutely. It was a spontaneous uprising against police harassment and brutality, and it became a symbol of resistance, a refusal to be silenced or marginalized any longer. It's often seen as the birth of the modern fight for LGBTQ plus rights.
It's amazing to think how far the movement has come since then, but also how much work still needs to be done to achieve full equality.
It's a testament to the courage and resilience of those who fought for their right to be recognized and respected.
So let's recap for a moment. We've seen how perceptions of homosexuality have shifted dramatically throughout history, from ancient cultures where it was integrated into social structures, to the rise of Christianity, which demonized it as a sin, and then to the medicalization of homosexuality in the 19th century, which viewed it as a disease. And now in the 20th century, we see the stirrings of a movement fighting back against those oppressive narratives.
It's a complex and fascinating story, and it really highlights how much of what we think of as natural or given about sexuality is actually shaped by culture, history, and power dynamics.
Right. It's not just about individual desires or preferences. It's about how those desires and preferences are understood, regulated, and controlled within a particular social context.
And that brings us to the final part of our deep dive. We focused primarily on Western history so far, but what about other cultures? How has they viewed and treated homosexuality? That's what we'll explore in part 3.
I'm ready for a broader perspective. Join us next time as we go global, exploring the diverse ways in which homosexuality has been understood and experienced around the world. Welcome back to our deep dive.
Yeah.
We've spent the last 2 parts exploring the complex history of how homosexuality has been viewed and treated in Western societies. But you also gave me some fascinating material about cultures outside of that Western lens, societies that often approach gender and sexuality in completely different ways.
Right.
I'm excited to dive into it.
It's a crucial part of the story, and it really challenges our assumptions about what's natural or universal when it comes to human sexuality.
Well, one of the first things that struck me was how many cultures outside of the West had traditions that recognized a third gender, like the Burdakes in some Native American cultures that we talked about earlier. Greenberg seems to find this pattern all over the world, doesn't he?
He does. It's not just a Western phenomenon. He talks about similar examples from Africa, Siberia, the Pacific Islands. Like, it's incredibly widespread. And what's fascinating is that these individuals weren't just tolerated. They often held important social and spiritual roles within their communities.
Right, like the Mahu in traditional Hawaiian culture,
Yeah.
they weren't forced to conform to a binary. They were embraced for embodying both masculine and feminine qualities.
Exactly. And Greenberg points out that the acceptance of these third gender individuals often correlates with the overall status of women in that society. Where women have more autonomy and respect, there tends to be greater acceptance of gender variance in general.
It's like looking at the acceptance of one form of difference can tell you a lot about how a society views difference as a whole.
It's a powerful connection, and it challenges us to think about the ways in which our own cultural biases might limit our understanding of other cultures.
It makes me wonder if some of those cultures that reported homosexuality as being rare or non-existent might have actually had different ways of understanding or categorizing same-sex attraction that simply didn't fit into the Western binary model.
It's definitely something to consider, especially when we're talking about cultures that have been heavily influenced by Western colonialism and its often rigid views on sexuality. It's like trying to understand a symphony using only the notes from a single scale.
Such a good analogy. And speaking of different scales, we talked about the age-structured model of homosexuality in Melanesia, where same-sex relations were common among young men as a part of their initiation rituals, but they were expected to transition to heterosexuality later in life. Greenberg finds similar examples in other cultures too, right?
He does. And it really underscores the point that what we might view as a fixed identity in the West was, in some cultures, seen as a fluid stage of life.
So it's not about labeling someone as gay or straight. It's about understanding the social function of those relationships within a particular cultural context.
Exactly. And it highlights the limitations of trying to impose a single universal definition of homosexuality across all cultures and time periods.
This entire deep dive has been such a mind-expanding experience. It's made me realize how much of what we take for granted about sexuality is actually a product of our own cultural and historical context.
I agree. And that's what makes Greenberg's work so important. He challenges us to see how the concept of homosexuality has been constructed by society, how it's been shaped by forces that go far beyond individual desire or biology.
It's a call to examine our own assumptions and to be open to the incredible diversity of human experience across cultures and throughout history.
And to recognize that this diversity isn't a threat, it's a source of richness and understanding.
Beautifully said. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. From ancient civilizations to the rise of Christianity, from the medicalization of homosexuality to the birth of the LGBTQ plus rights movement. and finally to a glimpse of how other cultures have navigated this complex aspect of human experience. What are some final thoughts you'd like to leave our listener with?
I think the key takeaway is that the story of homosexuality is still being written. It's an ongoing process of discovery, understanding, and challenging our own assumptions. And the more we learn about the past, the more we realize that the future is full of possibilities for creating a more just and inclusive world, where everyone is free to love and live authentically.
I couldn't agree more. This deep dive has given us so much to think about, and we hope it's inspired you to continue exploring this fascinating and ever-evolving story on your own. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey.